Something unusual was stirring in the heart of the Sahel, something powerful enough to shake old empires and redraw the world's political map. For decades, Burkina Faso had been treated like a quiet corner of Africa, a nation expected to follow, to obey, to wait. But without warning, everything changed. Behind sealed doors and silent midnight flights, a new set of alliances was being carved, not with the West, not with the usual power brokers, but across the vast expanse of Asia, and when the silence finally broke, the shockwave was global. Beijing listened, New Delhi recalculated, Tokyo paused. Western capitals panicked, because this wasn't just diplomacy, this was rebellion. A declaration that Burkina Faso would no longer accept its assigned place in the hierarchy of nations. It would choose its partners, it would shape its destiny. And it would drag the world into a new era of Pan-African confidence and geopolitical realignment. The question now isn't why Burkina Faso made this move. The real question, the one keeping foreign ministries awake tonight, is what happens when a nation the world underestimated decides to stand up and lead?
The Sahel sun rose over Ouagadougou like a molten coin, its edges trembling in the dry morning haze. Traders were already calling across dusty streets. Mopeds zipped between market stalls, the smell of brewing bissap tea mixed with the warm scent of freshly baked millet bread. Everything looked ordinary. Yet beneath the rhythm of another Burkinabe morning, something monumental was in motion, something that had been whispered only behind closed doors, in dimly lit offices, and in guarded corners of foreign embassies. For months, Burkina Faso had been sending quiet envoys eastward, not to Europe, not to Washington, but deeper across the world map, into the great capitals of Asia. Beijing, New Delhi, Kuala Lumpur, Jakarta, Seoul, even Hanoi. Not for aid, not for sympathy, not for handouts, but for something far more radical, partnership. The world had not noticed. Or rather, the world had assumed Burkina Faso could not move without Paris raising an eyebrow or Washington clearing its throat. But what the world forgot was that the Sahel had grown weary of being the chessboard on which other powers played. What outsiders dismissed as desert and dust was, in truth, a furnace producing some of Africa's most resilient, visionary minds. And these minds were quietly crafting a geopolitical realignment no analyst had predicted. In the capital, the first signals of change began emerging like cracks in old stone. Rumors flowed through the Ministry of Trade, where aides had grown accustomed to seeing foreign attaches from France or the EU wandering the corridors. But now new faces appeared, tall, reserved South Koreans with translation devices, calm, sharp-eyed diplomats from Vietnam, energetic Malaysians carrying briefcases filled with proposals, Indian strategists who spoke of engineering universities instead of military bases. At first, no one understood what this bouquet of new relationships meant. Then one morning, as reporters gathered for what they assumed was another routine announcement, the unexpected happened. Burkina Faso broke the silence. The press room froze as the foreign minister stepped forward and declared before cameras, "We are forging a new path, one built on dignity, mutual respect, and shared development." Burkina Faso is announcing a multi-nation partnership framework with key Asian states. We will collaborate on energy, agriculture, digital infrastructure, health innovation, and military self-reliance. A bold alliance is emerging, one not shaped by history's chains, but by tomorrow's possibilities. The room erupted. Questions flew like arrows. But the minister offered nothing more. The message was not for the press, it was for the world. That evening, the streets buzzed. Cafes filled with debates about what the alliance meant. Some people worried about retaliation from Western nations, but many felt a new pride swelling in their chests. For decades, Burkina Faso had been treated as peripheral, always needing rescue, assistance, or instruction. Now it dared to reframe its identity, not a footnote of geopolitics, but a protagonist. Across the Sahel, neighboring governments watched closely. Some admired the boldness. Others feared it. Some envied it. But throughout West Africa, from Dakar to Niamey to Bamako, something intangible but electric spread like a pulse. Africa could choose its partners. Africa could craft its own alliances. Africa could reject dependency. The turning point came when a delegation of Asian analysts landed in Ouagadougou weeks after the announcement. They were greeted not with red carpets or choreographed ceremony, but with a simple, confident reception hall lined with Burkinabe flags. This was no tribute to foreign guests. This was a meeting of equals. Leading the delegation was an experienced strategist from India named Vihan, who had spent years studying African economic trends. He expected hesitation, expected skepticism, expected to negotiate cautiously, as Asian powers were used to doing in Africa. Instead, the Burkinabe team sat across the table with an assertive clarity that startled him. "We are not here," one Burkinabe official said calmly, "to replace dependence on one external power with another. We are crafting a partnership where both sides rise. The era of Africa bending is over." Vihan nodded slowly, impressed. "Then let us shape that era together." Over the next months, the alliance took form not through flamboyant announcements, but through meticulous planning sessions held across Ouagadougou, Bobo Dioulasso, and Kédougou. Representatives from Asia walked fields with Burkinabe agronomists, testing soil samples. Engineers inspected half-built solar farms. Digital architects mapped out a fiber-optic backbone that would connect rural communities to the global data economy. The most transformative project, however, emerged from a series of late-night dialogues between Burkinabe scientists and Korean energy researchers. They envisioned something few nations on the continent had dared attempt: a Sahel-adapted green hydrogen program powered by solar energy. Burkina Faso, once considered an energy-poor country, could become a renewable powerhouse. If successful, the initiative would not only electrify the nation but export clean fuel to regional markets. For the first time in living memory, the world watched Burkina Faso not with pity, but with caution and curiosity. Analysts on international networks argued endlessly about whether the nation was shifting east, whether this was a new non-aligned movement, whether Africa was entering a second liberation wave. European diplomats voiced thinly veiled frustration. American officials called for dialogue and continuity. France, once the dominant power in the region, fell silent, its pride bruised by a move it had not anticipated and could not easily counter. Yet to the average Burkinabe farmer, student, trader, or teacher, these geopolitical storms mattered little. What mattered was what they could see with their own eyes. New irrigation systems began appearing in dry provinces thanks to Vietnamese water engineers who had mastered agriculture in challenging landscapes. Roads long left to decay were being repaired using Japanese hybrid asphalt technology adapted to the Sahel's heat. Solar microgrids in remote villages flickered to life under Bangladeshi assistance, bringing electricity to households that had spent generations in darkness. For the young, opportunities multiplied. Students received scholarships to study robotics in Singapore, agricultural biotechnology in India, sustainable mining in South Korea, and maritime security in Indonesia. They returned home, not to flee again, but to build. But the most powerful transformation was psychological. A quiet shift in collective self-perception rippled through the nation. For decades, African states had been conditioned to expect that development must come from outside, that they must follow Western templates, that progress was something granted, not seized. Now Burkina Faso stood as evidence that a country could redraw its place in the world through courage, strategy, and a refusal to be underestimated. The alliance, however, was not without its challenges. Opposition figures accused the government of moving too fast. Western lobbies attempted to discredit the agreements. Anonymous cyber operations attacked ministry servers. Foreign media outlets portrayed the partnership as a pivot toward authoritarian influence, ignoring the fact that Burkina Faso was seeking cooperation in technology, agriculture, and energy, not military occupation. But the nation stood firm. Every attempt to undermine the alliance only deepened domestic support. One night, as Harmattan winds swept across the city like pale ghosts, the foreign minister sat in his office overlooking the Capitol lights. On his desk were draft frameworks for new training academies jointly run with Malaysian economists, proposals for AI research exchanges with India, and a memorandum on cultural diplomacy with South Korea. But what caught his attention most was a handwritten letter from a farmer in Yaga province. "You are teaching our children that Burkina Faso can lead, not follow. That is the legacy we have waited for." He read it twice, then set it gently aside. Meanwhile, across Asia, the alliance garnered admiration. Many Asian nations saw in Burkina Faso not a client state, but a mirror. They too had been underestimated in the past, dismissed by global powers, denied equal voice. They recognized the courage of a nation choosing autonomy. This shared history of resilience became the emotional bridge of the alliance. In Beijing, officials described the partnership as a model for South-South cooperation. In New Delhi, the story circulated in policy circles as the Burkina Doctrine, the idea that smaller nations could reshape global power dynamics by forming equitable alliances beyond traditional spheres of influence. Even in Tokyo and Seoul, usually cautious in African strategic affairs, policymakers began speaking of Burkina Faso with newfound respect. As the alliance matured, Ouagadougou prepared to host the first Pan-African Asia Development Summit, an event that would bring together ministers, innovators, cultural leaders, and economists from across both continents. It would be a symbolic moment. Burkina Faso, once overlooked on global maps, would now host nations representing over half the world's population on Burkinabe soil. When the day finally arrived, the city transformed into a lively mosaic of cultures. Banners in French, English, Mandarin, Hindi, Bahasa Indonesia, Japanese, and Korean fluttered from streetlights. Markets sold amulets and calligraphy brushes side by side. Drummers played alongside taiko ensembles. Young volunteers wearing Faso Dan Fani fabric guided visitors through vibrant streets. The world had come to Ouagadougou, not to dictate terms, but to collaborate. The opening speech drew silence from thousands. Our ancestors told us, the speaker began, that a nation is not defined by its size, its wealth, or its armies. A nation is defined by its dignity, its vision, and its unity. Today, Burkina Faso stands not as a follower of old systems, but as a builder of new ones. With our friends across Asia, we aspire to forge a world where partnership replaces paternalism, where respect replaces dominance, and where the global South rises not in fragments, but as a community. The audience erupted. The summit ended with a declaration affirming shared commitment to sustainable development, fair trade, digital equity, climate resilience, and the protection of cultural identity. It was not a treaty of dependence, but a blueprint for mutual evolution. Days later, as visitors departed, the echoes of the summit lingered. Burkina Faso had not simply formed alliances, it had inspired a continental awakening. Across Africa, nations began exploring unconventional partnerships outside the Western sphere. Analysts started describing the shift as the Ouagadougou effect, the ripple caused by a seemingly small nation daring to reimagine its destiny. But for the people living through it, the change felt more like dawn after a long night. In the months that followed, more joint projects blossomed. A tech corridor linking Ouagadougou with Bengaluru began development, promising jobs for thousands. A Sahel Climate Innovation Institute, co-funded by Indonesia and South Korea, broke ground near Kadagu. Trade between Burkina Faso and Asia tripled within a year. Yet perhaps the most profound impact could be seen in the eyes of young Burkinabe girls and boys who no longer grew up believing that their country was weak or irrelevant. They grew up believing that their nation could negotiate with world powers as equals, could build green energy systems the world envied, could stand proudly on the global stage. It was this shift in consciousness that truly defined the new era. One evening, as the sun sank over Ouagadougou and painted the sky gold, an elderly griot told a group of children gathered beneath an acacia tree, "Remember this time. For centuries, others wrote our story. But now Burkina Faso writes its own. And when a nation writes its own story, it can choose endings no one expected." The children listened, wide-eyed, the future glowing in their imaginations. The griot smiled, his voice rich and steady. "A bold alliance has emerged," he said. "But the greatest alliance is the one between our past and our future, between who we were and who we have decided to become." And in that moment, under the fading Sahel light, the truth was undeniable. Burkina Faso had not just broken its silence. It had found its voice, and the world could no longer ignore it.